All right. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our digital Q&A with our guest Tim Hodge, who works for the Australian Space Agency. So we've got a really cool one in store for today. But before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional land of the Kaurna people, that I recognise their connection to this land, water, skies, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also extend those respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today, and also you might be visiting us from different places around the country, so the different people's lands that you're visiting us from today as well. So my name is Akshay. I work at the Australian Space Discovery Centre here in Adelaide, and today I'm assisted behind the scenes by Amber. If you have got any questions during our chat today, please just submit them through the Q&A, or if you're joining from a school, you can just ask your teacher to put them in, and then we can hopefully ask our guests here today. So one last piece of housekeeping is our session will be wrapping up just at about 2:45. So we've got about 45 minutes Central Standard Time today. But if you are in Adelaide, we invite you to stop into the Discovery Centre, or just contact us via the contact details on our website. So today our guest is Tim Hodge, as we said. He's joining us from, he works for the Australian Space Agency, and I might just hand over to you now, Tim, to give an introduction about yourself.
Sure, happy to, and thank you for having me. So my name is Tim Hodge, and my title is Assistant Director of Regulatory Review in the Space Regulation Sector at the Australian Space Agency. So that first photo on the left, doesn't look particularly exciting, but that's a picture of a piece of SpaceX debris from the Dragon spacecraft, and that landed in the Snowy Mountains in New South Wales near Jindabyne in mid-2022. Some of you might remember that. So I was lucky enough to be part of a team that went out and had to collect some of those pieces and take them into the agency's custody once that event happened. That picture in the middle is our new mission patch, and that commemorates 25 years of Australian space law. So that began with the commencement of what's called the Space Activities Act 1998, and that is now turned into the Space Launches and Returns Act 2018. And perhaps not everyone listening and watching will be aware, but Australia actually has quite a long and proud history of space law and regulation, and that goes back to the 1998 Act, but even further beyond that. And in my role, I'm very much aware that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. There's a lot of people that have come before me in my role that have done some fantastic work to set up our space regulation system that we have today, and we'll have a couple of small events across the month to mark that pretty big milestone for Australia. The final photo on the right is of the Deep Space Station 46 antenna, and that's at the Canberra Deep Space Communication Complex. So that particular dish that I'm standing in front of is most famous for receiving and relaying the first TV images of the Apollo 11 moon landing, which I think is quite cool. And the Deep Space Communication Complex also tracks a number of other very important and exciting missions, including the NASA Voyager missions, which have now left our solar system, which I find pretty mind-blowing. And these second ones here are a little bit more about me and what I do in my downtime, I guess. So the one on the left is actually an album called The Race for Space by a band called Public Service Broadcasting. It's a great album, and I'll definitely give it a plug and encourage everyone to listen to it. It actually charts the space race between the US and the USSR through the 50s and 60s, and actually includes archival recordings of some of the actual events that happened. So, for example, the Apollo 11 moon landing is played out in a song called Go, which is a real bop, so I definitely recommend that one. I'm a child of the 90s, so that picture top middle is of The Simpsons, and I'll never miss an opportunity to cram Simpsons reference in anywhere. And this is a fantastic episode that I loved as a kid, where Homer actually gets to join a NASA mission to space, and ruffled ships cause a bit of havoc on the spacecraft. On the right is a book I'm reading at the moment called When the Heavens Went on Sale by Ashley Vance. and that charts 4 different private space companies that are trying to establish themselves in the US space market, particularly in the wake of SpaceX and the way that SpaceX has, I guess, changed the game for launch services. It also includes a profile of Rocket Lab, which is a US New Zealand company, and its founder, Peter Beck. And probably my favourite story in that book is Peter Beck's attempts to create a rocket bike as a young kid. Not something I would probably advise anyone to do, but he has a really fascinating story and someone who is doing fantastic work with Rocket Lab. And the one down the bottom, the circular one, so when I'm not working with the agency, I'm a big fan of a game called Disc Golf. Some people might know it as Frisbee Golf, and that's a lot like regular golf, except you have a Frisbee instead of a ball and a club. And when I was browsing online once, I couldn't help going past this disc here called an uplink, which includes the Deep Space Communication Complex that I was just talking about, and a reference to Canberra. So I'm actually not someone that does a lot of space pop culture outside my work, just because I'm working with it every day, but I've managed to fit 4 different references in there, so I'm pretty happy with that.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for that intro. Just while we wait for some questions from the audience, I have some of my own. I was just kind of hoping or wondering if you wanted to take us maybe through like a day in your life at work. What do you do? What's kind of the day-to-day tasks? What are some of the really interesting things happen? Maybe like I guess when that piece of SpaceX junk landed, was it like, oh my gosh, what do we do? You know? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely happy to. So in my role, which is called Regulatory Review in the Space Regulation Team, so essentially that means I'm in a small team that works on supporting the maintenance and development of Australia's laws for space legislation. So everyone might not know, but Australia actually has laws that regulate if you would like to launch a rocket or and do any other sort of space activities or launch a high power rocket from Australia, or if you're an Australian who wants to do space activities overseas, we have legislation in place that you need to comply with. And particularly people need authorisations under that act, so they need approval from the minister to carry out those sort of activities. So a lot of my work is about developing an understanding of those laws, how they operate, why they're written the way they are, what they're trying to do, which we'll use in our team to think about what sort of changes we might want to consider in the short, medium and long term for that. In terms of what I do day to day, no 2 days are really the same, I have to say. A lot of times I'll come in with the start of my week and I'll have a pretty solid plan of what I want to get done that day, and I get to Friday and I realise the week has been completely different, and that's okay. To have a few surprises and different challenges along the way. I think my job day to day, it involves a lot of collaboration. So we have the Australian Space Agency, and we're responsible for the Space Launches and Returns Act and dealing with that legislation. But that cuts across a lot of other different areas. So talking with people across different government departments that have their own responsibilities that relate to space. That might be talking with people in the sector, and even just talking with people across our agency. So figuring out they might want to try to achieve a particular object, and we have to try and figure out, is that what the law says? Is that the way we can read it to support that sort of stuff? How do we get some practical outcomes to do those sorts of things? That was very interesting when that SpaceX space debris did come down. It's not the first time that's happened in Australia. We have had previous instances of space debris landing in Australia, but it's been quite some time since there was a significant, I guess, debris event. So from our side, in our team and the colleagues that I worked with, we were having a think about some of our international obligations. So there are quite a number of treaties that relate to space and how different space actors need to work together. One of them, called the Rescue Agreement, deals with what happens if space debris that your country owns lands in another country. So we were doing a lot of work to think about what do we need to do as Australia to make sure we're abiding by our treaty obligations, and then also the I guess the practical work of going out and checking out that object. So we have a colleague that deals with launch safety who travelled out, got to take some photos of the object, make sure it's not particularly hazardous, and then also figure out a plan to transport that object back to Canberra. So yeah, not something that happens every day, but it was certainly very exciting, and I was happy to play a very small part in helping out with that.
Yeah, that's really cool. So where does the piece of space junk live now? Is it in a museum? Is it in, federal custody?
That's a good question. There were quite a few different bits. I'm not sure where quite all of them ended up. I believe a major bit went back to the US for SpaceX to examine that piece of space debris and check out why it didn't do exactly what it was supposed to do in the beginning. But yes, some of them have travelled near and far as well.
Right, cool. You mentioned a couple of times while you were speaking the Space Launch and Returns Act. Would you maybe just for our audience like to go through what exactly that is, and maybe some other important bits of legislation to do with the space industry, and I guess what they entail and why they're really, really important for the practices that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the Space Launches and Returns Act is the main piece of Australian legislation that deals with space activities, and it incorporates some of our really important obligations that I was mentioning before in terms of we've signed up to a few international treaties, and we implement some of our obligations under those treaties by setting up the Space Launches and Returns Act and setting up responsibilities for how we give effect to those. One of the main objects of the Act as well is to maintain a balance. So that balance is between the safety of those activities on the one hand, which is really, really important, but also with industry growth. So making sure that we're enabling people that want to develop commercial space interests in Australia have a framework that allows them to do that. So that's a really interesting question. Not always easy to grapple with. How do you balance those two things, which sometimes have tension with each other? But that's some of the work that we do and some of the things that we're thinking about day to day. We also have what are called rules. So that's subordinate legislation that sits under the Act, and they give some of the day-to-day details about giving a little bit more information about how the Act works. So, for example, the Act says if you'd like to launch a rocket in Australia, you have to apply for an Australian launch permit, and we have the rules, and they say, here's the kind of information you need to give us so that we can think about that and make sure that we're happy with all the things you're proposing and make sure that it's going to be safe as well. We also have a couple of other documents that sit under the rules as well that help just give it even a little bit more information to people about safety and insurance requirements as well. There's a really wide range of legislation. I couldn't list them all because I'd probably leave someone out, and I wouldn't want to do that. But anything from work health and safety to marine safety. We work closely with colleagues in aviation as well, also with our colleagues in states and territory governments, because they have different responsibilities that sometimes cross over with what we're doing. Yeah, there's quite a lot of collaboration involved and having discussions with different bodies to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, thank you for that. You said something. You also touched on something earlier, which I thought was really interesting. It was how your work is also concerned with Australians doing things overseas. Does that mean just like if an Australian company wants to launch with SpaceX or something, or is that like any Aussie citizen, if they want to do something space related, that still is concerned with the Australian Space Agency, even if, you know, say they're doing something that's completely in America, but they're just an Aussie citizen? Is that something that agency is concerned with, or only if they're like an Australian company wanting to launch overseas? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's mainly what we're interested in, is if they're, and the Act terms them a responsible party. So if they're the responsible party, so they themselves or they have a company that's going to, for example, something very common, they want to launch a payload that's going to be on a SpaceX Falcon rocket, and they have a payload that they want to put on there, and it's them or their company that owns that payload. That's the kind of things we're interested in. And in that particular example, they would have to apply for what's called an overseas payload permit. Not quite as onerous as the kind of things we would ask if you want to launch a rocket in Australia, but there's still a bit of information that we ask for just to make sure that certain criteria in the Act are met relating to safety and abiding by Australia's international obligations.
Okay, interesting. One of the things we talk a lot about at the Space Discovery Centre is that space jobs are not just for an engineer or somebody who had like a directly STEM career. And you're a great example of that. You're a lawyer. You worked in WHS, I think I read from your bio. Would you maybe like to give us a little bit of a intro to how you got into the space industry? Maybe what prompted that? What interests you about the space industry? Why'd you make the switch, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so a little bit about my background. I studied law at the University of Canberra, and apart for some time to do a little bit of travel in the middle. And I actually, when I was at university, I was lucky enough to do what's called an honours thesis. So you get to write a little bit about a topic of your choice. And I chose the legal framework for civil launches in Australia, which yeah, it wasn't something I got to study at university as well. So I thought in my honours thesis, I'd take the opportunity to delve into something. And if I need to write 10,000 words on something, it should be something that I'm really going to enjoy and something that's really interesting. And following, I guess, the completion of my study, I was lucky enough to get a job in the government. So first working as a paralegal, and then as a government lawyer following that. And have worked across a couple of different departments in that time. So I started out with what's called the Department of Home Affairs, and particularly working with immigration and customs. So doing some legal training. There are people doing roles there that need to make decisions about granting people a visa, which gives them permission to travel to Australia. And there's Australian Border Force officers that work at our airports and ports and other places around Australia and make sure that everyone entering has the proper documentation, and if they're importing things, they're doing that lawfully. And so my role there, particularly in a legal training context, was to give them some information to support them to make sure they're doing their job lawfully. They have some pretty serious powers. You can detain someone if you're an officer in the department, which is a pretty serious power. So you want to make sure you're using that properly and lawfully. So that was my role there, as well as doing some legal advice. And following that, I did work for what's called Safe Work Australia, and they develop policy for work health and safety and workers' compensation schemes in Australia. So while the Department of Home Affairs is massive, there's about 15,000 people in that department, and you tend to be in a role where you're very specialised. So you do one thing in your role and you do that really, really well. Safe Work Australia is a bit different because there was only 100 people. So there I was in a team of 4 or 5 lawyers, and we did everything from work health and safety to contracts and freedom of information and privacy and training. So unlike Home Affairs, where it's very specialised, you almost have to be a jack of all trades. So between those two roles, I felt pretty fortunate that I got a good experience of both ends of what it's like working as a government lawyer. And from Safe Work Australia, I was fortunate enough to get a role with the Australian Space Agency, first on a temporary secondment and now in a full-time role. And yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about, I guess, how I got that role. It wasn't, I guess, something that happens every day. So yeah, happy to expand on that if you'd like.
Yeah, I think that that'd be really interesting to hear, because it is always cool to hear about careers that, you know, are not STEM related, but are very, very important in the space industry. So yeah, if you wanted to expand on that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, space was something I was always really interested in and really passionate about. But probably particularly when I was studying at university, even when I did my honours thesis and then starting my career, I didn't think it was probably something I could do as a job or as a career. Yeah, coming from a non-STEM background, so coming from a legal role and not having a maths or an engineering background, for example, I couldn't see myself working in those sort of roles because that's what I thought the only things that were out there were those STEM type roles. But I just continued to keep an eye on the industry and what was happening. I was really happy when the Australian Space Agency was stood up. And that was something that I recommended in my thesis. I'm not sure if that was the tipping point that made them go in that direction, but I was very happy when that was stood up. And I applied for a few roles as the agency was being developed and didn't get them at that time, I think just because I was needed to have a little bit more experience first. But I definitely kept that interest, and I just mentioned to my manager that that was something that I was interested in. That's a little bit tricky sometimes to say to your manager that you like to work in a different job in a different field. But it definitely wasn't because I didn't enjoy the work I was doing at the time. It was obviously just a passion of mine. And eventually that led to a situation where I was offered the chance to come across to the space agency on a temporary secondment and into a role I didn't realise existed, I guess, when I first did it. But now that I've been in it for a while, I've seen some of the thinking that that other people who have been in similar roles have done for me. I really see the need and why it's so important to have people thinking about our domestic legislation, making sure it's maintained, thinking about improvements for the future. Yeah, so Amanda, if you're listening, thank you for the opportunity to do this comment, and it's worked out well for me in the long run.
Yeah, awesome. It's really cool to hear, because there are a lot of people that, you know, we speak to at, you know, various events who, you know, it's like, you know, there's no point talking to you guys because I don't really like science. And so it is really, really cool to hear stories like yours, where, you know, you don't have to like, you might like science, but you don't have to, you know, you don't have to have a career in that to still be directly related in the space industry. And so we have a question from the audience. Someone's asked, do you have any advice for young people who are studying humanities but still want to be involved in space?
Yep, great question. Probably the main thing is it's possible. I've done it, so I guess I'm an example that you can have a non-STEM career and follow those opportunities if that's something you'd really like to do. Probably the best advice that I've received and I like to pass on to people is that you're the best advocate for yourself. I've been really fortunate that I've had colleagues and friends and family who've looked out for me and helped to push me in different directions and get opportunities. But ultimately it was on me to say, this is something that I want to do and chase up those opportunities and take a little bit of a risk to say, I'd like to try something different. And I guess there's no perfect, or there's no single way to achieve that. And there's lots of different ways you could get into a space career, and it might not necessarily be the first thing you do. So for example, I worked across a couple of different areas of government before I landed in space. And I think that's really helped me to have a really good grounding and a really good understanding of government law, of administrative decision making, and also just a little bit of life and work experience before I've landed in this role. So it's okay if space isn't your first thing that you do. But the second thing is, yeah, if it's something you're really interested, um, get get involved. And there's definitely lots of ways to get involved. Join a group. There's lots of school and university groups that have an interest in space and do things like rocketry or other things. Join a newsletter. The Space Discovery Centre and the Space Agency have great newsletters that keep people up to date on things that are happening in Australia's space sector. And another good example is a group called the Australian New Zealand Space Law Council, and that's a group that you can volunteer to join if you would like, and they talk about space law matters across Australia and New Zealand. So even if it's something that you can't, I guess, see the opportunities to start in a career straight away, there's definitely different opportunities that can lead to that if you put yourself out there and try to find those sorts of things.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, I also want to, stress the get involved thing. Being a student myself, being involved in, clubs, attending, events, different societies, sort of careers and industry nights has really been helpful. If you're fortunate enough to live in either Sydney or Adelaide, or fortunate enough to travel there, annually they have a space forum. And I'm assuming if you're asking for young people, you're a student, you can get a student discount ticket, and they can be really good because you've got all the space companies in one spot, and you can literally just go up to them and be like, hey, this is my background. What pathways could there be at your company, and they might pass you in the right direction. And one of the things that myself and a lot of people have found is that in Australia the space industry is very new, and so a lot of people also don't know things. Everybody's still learning, and so if you just everybody and because everybody's still learning or has only learned things recently, it means that everybody's very willing to help. So if you see a company that you like, you can just email them, you can contact them on LinkedIn, and just be like, hey, this is something, I think your company is really cool. Is there any way I can get involved? Can we have a chat? And so that's something really interesting. Just to note, networking can be really important into getting, in any sort of industry that you like. But yeah, speaking of learning and new learning, obviously the agency itself is quite new, only hit 5 years old this year. So during your time at the agency, have you seen, I guess, any changes in space regulation and things like that? Because they would be new for quite a lot of people there, and so. Have you seen, in terms of the agency itself, how have things developed since you've joined?
Something very exciting, I guess, that's happened since I joined was the agency's got a little bit bigger. So there's more people than there used to be, which is fantastic because it gives us more opportunities to get things done and do some good. And in terms of, I guess, other changes, an exciting milestone, I guess, in my team is that in mid this year we made our first legislative change to space legislation, and that's the first change since there were significant amendments to the Act and the rules that sit underneath that in 2018 and 19. So we made that change in mid this year, and it's a relatively small change to start, but I think that sets us on that path of continuing to think about what our legislation looks like, where we can improve, if we can make those simple improvements, how do we get those together, how do we talk about those with our industry and with other partners. So yeah, we are definitely seeing some change coming through, which is very exciting.
Yeah, that's really cool, especially passing through your first bit of changes is really, really cool. We have a couple questions from the audience now. Someone's asked, what is the best part of your job?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably the opportunities I've gotten. So getting to go out and see a bit of space junk up close and in person or space debris, sorry, wasn't something that I thought would be part of my resume. So that's a great opportunity. And in general, just the opportunities for the kind of people that you get to meet. So I'm lucky enough to be part of a great team, that we all work really well together, and we've had opportunities to meet with colleagues around the country. We get opportunities to have discussions with colleagues internationally as well. Obviously, the United Nations and other really important international fora are a big part of the international regulation of space and talking about different frameworks or different treaties. So I think those kinds of opportunities to get to meet people, interact with people, see things that you might not get to do in a day-to-day role has definitely been a big positive for me.
Yeah, cool. We have another question. How do you are there any resources, either freely or cheaply available for people just who just want to learn about law? Maybe not, take a degree, but if they want to learn about Australian space law, do you know of anything? This might be quizzing you, but do you know anything off the top of your head that could help with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first resource that comes to mind, which is really good and gives people a primer without any assumed knowledge, is The Conversation. So that's a website where different journalists and experts in their field can come in and write a piece about things that are important or new updates that are going on with them. That was definitely a way that I kept in touch with what was happening in the industry when I wasn't working here, was by reading some of those kind of pieces on changes that were happening or updates. So yeah, I definitely recommend that. There's quite a number of space contributors they've had in the past that have written some really good and enlightening articles there.
Yeah, interesting. And I think just to add on that, I'm pretty sure if you just Google some of the legislation, it should be available online in like PDF form, because I think a lot of it is just like publicly available.
Yes, yeah, all of our
Yeah.
legislation is publicly available. So you can go to the Federal Register of Legislation, which doesn't roll off the tongue, but anything you're interested in space legislation is there. Even things which people might not think of and they're not necessarily sexy reading, like it's called an explanatory memorandum. And that just gives a little bit of background about why the legislation was written and what it's trying to achieve. Some of those things can be really interesting if you do have a passion or it's something you might want to check out. Some of those are a good place to start because they give a bit of a background of what the people were thinking when they were drafting this legislation and what they were trying to achieve.
Yeah, cool. So to the person who asked that, sounds like you got a lot of reading you can you can take a look at. I got a very interesting question. So from a regulations/law perspective, what are some of the big challenges you think that we might face as people venture, further out in the solar system?
That's a good question. I probably won't venture too much myself on that one. We're actually really keen to chat with some of our sector, some of our academic colleagues and others to find out what they think. So I don't want to prejudge that one too much, apart to say watch this space.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess it's like an unknown, for everybody.
Yeah.
Whether, because it is quite a new thing. Nobody's landed on Mars yet. Nobody lives on the moon. Nobody lives on Mars. So what are the rules going to be? So it'd be interesting to see how that develops.
Absolutely.
Would you go to space?
Or would I go to space?
Yeah.
That's a really good question, actually. I would love to. I've read people talking about the overview effect that they get being up in space and being able to look back on the Earth. But I'm a little bit of a scaredy cat. I don't like to take risks, so I think I'm happy enough just being on the ground and supporting other people to do it for now.
Yeah, that's completely fair. I think I'm a little bit similar. Did have a couple more questions. So, I guess like maybe from your, you mentioned, you had your interest as, since you were young, in space, and then you got to see, this agency be developed. And even though you weren't successful, you were, watching it and you were, actively applying. So how has your I guess, understanding of Australia in space sort of changed throughout your life?
Yeah, probably the most significant change for me is yeah, realizing it's not just for engineers. That they're a really important part of the process, but there are other opportunities out there. And I think that's maybe a little bit of visibility. Space regulation isn't new. We're coming up to our 25-year anniversary. Some countries go back even further, and Australia, having a role in the space, also is older than 25 years. So yeah, it's not even exactly a new field, but maybe the visibility of it has really increased in the past, say, 5 to 10 years in particular. And I think that's we're also interconnected now. So we all, I think space has a much more prominent role in the media and in journalism and people's understanding. People understand how much of our daily lives now comes from space and space services, things that we rely on from satellites. Yeah, so I think that's probably the main thing, is just being part of that growing wave, and it finally, I guess, hitting the mainstream and becoming a career that's now talked about as something that's possible, as opposed to it being something that's so far off and unattainable, and only a few people are in those roles and in that space.
Yeah, I think what you touched on at the end is a really important thing where, um, that's kind of the purpose of the Discovery Center, and the reason why, a lot of the space companies do all this outreach stuff is trying to break that sort of perception that space is just for, a handful of geniuses, and it's this unattainable career when really, anyone can get involved. You don't have to be, insanely knowledgeable and have, 20 million things on your resume to work in the space industry. You can um, start from anywhere, right? There are students doing really interesting stuff in the space industry, and so yes, I guess like breaking that is a really really important point that you touched on, and something that we want to stress here at the Discovery Center as well, and in the agency overall, is that yeah, just pursue it. If you like space, just do it. You don't have to, yeah, don't count yourself out. Don't sell yourself short and think that yeah.
Take
Yeah.
all the kind of skill sets that I have might be something the next person to come along might have completely different skill sets, and that's totally fine. There's no perfect way of doing these sorts of roles, and there's lots of different approaches you can take. So just because you have particular skills, yeah, absolutely don't sell yourself short. Just think about the way you can use those skills to the best of your ability to do the things you really want to do.
Yeah, cool. Um, so we'll just go through some final questions, maybe. Like, what are some personal attributes and skills that you think someone might need or would help them to excel in this field?
So it's a general law one that particularly applies in this context is probably strategic thinking skills. So you might have a picture in your head about the way you want something to go, and it's really important to be able to think about what objectives you want to be able to achieve. Um, but then sometimes things don't turn out the way you expected, or you might come up with some challenges that you hadn't been able to account for originally. Um, so having those strategic thinking skills and those problem solving skills to be able to deal with that is really important. Um, and then I think generally having a good bit of patience and resolve doesn't hurt either. The kind of work that we're doing in the agency doesn't happen overnight, and it takes a lot of hard work even to do something like our initial rule changes that we did this year, which were relatively simple. There's a lot of thinking and a lot of legwork that needs to go in and make those happen. So don't be afraid of a little bit of hard work, and if things aren't going your way, don't be afraid to keep pushing at it if it's something that you believe in.
Yeah, that's a really important message. Thank you for that. Just as a final question, did you vote in for the rover name? If so, what did you vote for? And what do you think of the name Rover?
I did vote. We weren't allowed to suggest names, but we were allowed to vote, so I took that opportunity. I didn't vote for Ruva, I have to be honest. My dad probably won't like it, but I'm not a fan of the pun in Ruva. But democracy is spoken, and I'm happy to get behind our winner and fully support it and support our missions to the moon and beyond.
Yeah, that's that's fair. I feel like Ruper is one of those names that the rest of the world is going to absolutely love. They're going to be like, "Oh my gosh, that's so Aussie, that's so Australian." Um, oh, we did have one last question from the audience just pop through. What was the most surprising part of your job?
Oh, the most surprising part. I'm not sure, to be honest. Yeah, maybe just how I think the variety of different work. I had a particular idea in my mind coming into the agency of what a space role would look like, and that was a pretty sort of narrow field of view. Um, but now coming in and seeing the really wide range of work that our agents get to do every day, um, all the kinds of different issues and problems that we're thinking about solving. Yeah, as I said, one day is never like the next because there are so many different interesting things going on. And so I think that's a pleasant surprise, which is the best kind.
Yeah, awesome. Well, unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us and listening to Tim. And thank you so much to you, Tim, for walking us through, career and just answering all the amazing questions that our audience have come up with. It's been really interesting, really exciting. And yeah, hopefully, we could do a part 2 Q&A at some point. And just to the audience, if you want to learn more about space in Australia or how to become a space expert, please come visit us at the Australian Space Discovery Centre. If you are in Adelaide or if you're visiting Adelaide, we're in Lot 14. So you should definitely come check us out. But yeah, thank you so much to everybody, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.